When Lady Catherine Ashford entered the drawing-room that evening, the conversation did not pause. The rustle of her silk gown against the doorway, the soft click of her heeled shoes upon the polished wood, these sounds dissolved into the air as though they had never existed at all. The wives of her husband's associates continued their animated discussion of the upcoming season, their voices bright and musical, their laughter like the tinkling of crystal. Catherine stood for a moment in the threshold, her gloved hands folded at her waist, her expression composed in that particular way she had perfected over 7 years of marriage, serene, unthreatening, nearly invisible. She had learned through countless evenings such as this one that to demand attention was to invite ridicule, and to appear wounded was to confirm one's irrelevance. So she simply moved forward, choosing a chair near the window, where the last light of the winter afternoon cast long shadows across the room, and she sat with her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed upon some distant point beyond the glass. The Marquis of Ashford, her husband, stood near the fireplace with 3 other gentlemen, discussing matters of parliament and estate management with the easy authority of men who had never questioned their right to speak. He was a handsome man, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and eyes the colour of winter storms. When they had married, Catherine had been 19, the daughter of an earl whose fortune had dwindled to almost nothing, and she had believed naively, desperately, that affection might grow between them with time. She had entered Ashford House with hope in her heart, with a willingness to please, with every intention of becoming the sort of wife a marquis required. But 7 years had passed, and Lord Ashford still looked at her the way one might regard a piece of furniture. Necessary, perhaps, but utterly unremarkable, easily forgotten the moment one left the room. Catherine watched the firelight play across the faces of the other women, illuminating their animated expressions, their confident gestures. Lady Pemberton was speaking of her daughter's upcoming debut, her voice filled with maternal pride. Mrs. Hartley was laughing at some witty remark Lady Thornton had made, her hand pressed delicately to her chest. These women moved through society like ships with full sails, certain of their course, while Catherine felt herself drifting anchorless through waters that never seemed to grow warmer or more welcoming. She had tried in the early years to join their conversations, to offer her own observations, but her words had fallen flat, met with polite smiles that never reached the eyes, with subtle shifts of attention away from her and towards someone more interesting, more worthy of notice. And so she had learned to be quiet, to occupy her designated space without demanding anything more, to accept that her role was to be present but not heard, seen but not remembered. Outside the window, snow began to fall. Catherine watched the flakes drift past the glass, each one unique and fragile, disappearing the moment it touched the ground. She thought of her wedding day, of standing beside Lord Ashford in the chapel at his family's estate, of the way her hands had trembled when he placed the ring upon her finger. She had worn her mother's veil, yellowed with age but beautiful still, and she had looked up at her new husband with such hope, such terrible, foolish hope. He had smiled at her, a brief, perfunctory expression, and then turned to face the priest, and Catherine had understood even then that whatever dreams she carried in her heart would remain hers alone. The drawing-room grew darker as the afternoon surrendered to evening. A servant entered to light the candles, and the room transformed into a space of golden warmth and dancing shadows. Catherine remained in her chair by the window, watching the reflection of the flames in the glass, listening to the conversations that swirled around her like a river flowing past a stone. Lady Pemberton asked Lord Ashford's opinion on some matter of politics, and he answered with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being heard, his voice carrying across the room. Catherine knew that voice intimately, the way it softened when he spoke to his horses, the way it hardened when he addressed the servants, the way it remained carefully neutral when he spoke to her, as though she were a stranger he encountered regularly but had no particular interest in knowing. Dinner was announced, and the party moved toward the dining room in a rustle of silk and murmured conversation. Catherine rose from her chair and followed, her movements graceful and practiced, her expression serene. At the table she found herself seated between Mr. Hartley, who spoke exclusively to the gentleman on his other side, and Lord Thornton, who acknowledged her presence, with a brief nod before turning his attention to the woman across from him. Catherine arranged her napkin in her lap and studied the pattern on the china before her, delicate blue flowers intertwined with gold leaves, beautiful and cold. The first course was served and conversation flowed around her like water around a stone, and Catherine ate her soup in silence, tasting nothing, feeling nothing except the familiar weight of her own invisibility. Across the table, Lord Ashford was speaking with Lady Pemberton, his attention fully engaged, his expression animated in a way Catherine rarely witnessed when he looked at her. She watched him through lowered lashes, observing the way his hands moved as he spoke, the way his eyes lit with interest, and she felt something twist inside her chest. Not jealousy, precisely, but a deeper, more pervasive grief, the kind that settles into one's bones and becomes as much a part of the body as blood or breath. She had long ago ceased hoping that he might look at her that way, might speak to her with that level of engagement, but the absence of hope did not diminish the ache of knowing she would never be enough to inspire it. After dinner, the ladies withdrew to the music room while the gentlemen remained for port and cigars. Catherine sat on a settee near the pianoforte and listened as Lady Thornton performed a sonata with considerable skill. The music filled the room, complex and beautiful, and Catherine closed her eyes and let it wash over. Her imagining herself somewhere else, someone else, a woman who was noticed, valued, loved. But when the piece ended and she opened her eyes, she was still exactly where she had always been, present but unnoticed, visible but unseen, alive but somehow less than fully real. When the gentlemen finally joined them, Lord Ashford entered the room, and his gaze passed over Catherine as though she were part of the wallpaper. He moved to speak with Lord Pemberton, and Catherine watched him. This man she had promised to love and honour, this stranger she shared a home with but never a heart. The evening wore on, and eventually the guests began to depart, calling for their carriages, gathering their wraps. Catherine stood near the door and bid them farewell, with the same practiced grace she brought to every social obligation, and not one of them seemed to notice that she had barely spoken all evening, that she had been among them, but never truly with them. When the last guest had gone and the house fell quiet, Catherine climbed the stairs to her chambers. The corridors of Ashford House stretched long and cold before her, lit by candles that cast more shadow than light. She could hear Lord Ashford's footsteps in another wing of the house, moving toward his own rooms, and she knew with absolute certainty that he would not come to hers, that he would sleep alone as he always did, and that tomorrow would be exactly like today, and the day after that, and all the days that followed. She entered her bedchamber and closed the door behind her, and only then, in the privacy of her own space, did she allow her shoulders to drop, her carefully maintained composure to slip. She stood before the mirror and looked at her own reflection, a young woman, still just 26, with dark hair and eyes that had once held light, but now seemed dim, extinguished by years of being overlooked, undervalued, forgotten. She thought of her mother, dead these 5 years now, who had told her on her wedding day that marriage was a duty, not a romance, and that contentment came from accepting one's role with grace. Catherine had tried. God knew she had tried. But how much grace was required to endure a lifetime of being treated as though one did not matter? How much strength did it take to wake each morning and face another day of invisibility? She did not know. She knew only that she was tired, tired of trying, tired of hoping, tired of the endless, aching silence that had become her existence. Outside her window, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the gardens in white, muffling all sound, transforming the world into something quiet and still, and achingly beautiful. Catherine pressed her hand against the cold glass and watched the flakes descend, each one falling alone, disappearing into the vast whiteness below, and she understood with sudden, perfect clarity that this was her life, to fall silently, to disappear without trace, to exist without ever being truly seen. The winter months passed with the same relentless monotony that had characterized every season of Catherine's marriage. January brought frost that painted the windows of Ashford House in delicate patterns of ice. February brought storms that howled through the chimneys and rattled the shutters, and March arrived with the promise of spring that never quite materialized, the gardens remaining brown and dormant beneath skies the color of old pewter. Through it all, Catherine moved through her days, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to exist in the spaces between other people's lives, to occupy her designated role without ever encroaching upon anyone's attention or concern. She woke each morning before dawn, when the house was still silent and the servants had not yet begun their daily routines. She would sit by the window in her bedchamber and watch the sun rise over the bare trees of the park, the light slowly spreading across the frozen ground, and she would think of nothing in particular, allowing her mind to remain as blank and empty as the winter landscape before her. This was her time, the only moments of the day that truly belonged to her, and she guarded them with fierce, silent determination. When the clock struck 7, she would rise and dress with the help of her maid, a quiet girl named Mary who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that Lady Ashford preferred silence to meaningless chatter. They moved through the morning ritual without speaking, Mary lacing Catherine's corset, fastening the endless row of tiny buttons that ran down the back of her day dress, arranging her hair in the simple style Catherine favoured. Nothing elaborate, nothing that might draw attention or invite comment. Breakfast was a solitary affair. Lord Ashford took his meals in his study, surrounded by correspondence and newspapers, while Catherine ate in the morning room, looking out over the gardens she had once imagined she might redesign, might fill, with roses and lavender and all the flowers she had loved as a girl. But she had learned in her first year of marriage that the gardens belonged to Lord Ashford's mother, the Dowager Marchioness, who lived in the dower house on the far side of the estate and who visited Ashford House with alarming frequency, always ready to offer opinions on every aspect of Catherine's conduct, from her choice of gowns to her management of the household staff. The Dowager had made it clear, in her cold, cutting manner, that Catherine was acceptable as a marchioness only insofar as she remained unobtrusive, caused no trouble, and produced an heir, a task at which Catherine had thus far failed, much to everyone's disappointment. After breakfast, Catherine would meet with the housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, to review the day's plans and address any concerns regarding the household. Mrs. Davies was a capable woman in her 50s who had served the Ashford family for decades, and she treated Catherine with the same polite distance that everyone else seemed to employ, respectful but remote, willing to follow instructions but never offering the warmth or confidence that might suggest genuine regard. Catherine would approve menus, discuss repairs that needed to be made, address issues with the servants, all while maintaining the calm, pleasant demeanor expected of a woman in her position. She was good at this part of her role, at least. She managed the household efficiently, kept everything running smoothly, ensured that Lord Ashford's life proceeded without disruption or inconvenience. It was, she understood, the primary purpose of her existence, to be useful without being intrusive, present without being noticed. The afternoons were the longest part of the day. Sometimes there were social calls to make or receive, obligations that Catherine fulfilled with the same quiet grace she brought to every aspect of her life. She would sit in drawing rooms identical to her own, listening to women discuss the same topics they always discussed: children, servants, the latest fashions, the scandals whispered about but never openly acknowledged. Catherine contributed little to these conversations, offering only the occasional murmur of agreement or polite question, and no one seemed to notice her reticence or care that she remained largely silent. She had become, over the years, the kind of woman people looked past rather than at, someone whose presence was acknowledged but never truly registered, like a piece of furniture that had always been there and therefore ceased to merit attention. On days when there were no social obligations, Catherine would retreat to the library, the one room in Ashford House where she felt she could breathe without constraint. Lord Ashford rarely used the library, preferring his study for work and the drawing room for leisure, and so Catherine had claimed this space as her own, spending hours among the leather-bound volumes that lined the shelves. From floor to ceiling, she read voraciously, hungrily, losing herself in novels and poetry, in histories and travel narratives, in anything that transported her beyond the confines of her own limited existence. She read of women who defied convention, who traveled to distant lands, who loved passionately and lived boldly, and she mourned for all the things she would never experience, all the life she would never live beyond these walls. Sometimes in the library, she would encounter Lord Ashford. By accident, he would enter in search of some specific volume, and he would nod at her with distant courtesy, retrieve his book, and depart without speaking more than a few words. Catherine had ceased trying to engage him in conversation years ago, had learned that her attempts at connection were met with polite but firm discouragement, as though he found even the prospect of genuine dialogue with his wife to be somehow burdensome. She did not understand what she had done to inspire such indifference, could not identify the moment when she had failed so profoundly that he had given up even pretending to care. She knew only that she had tried everything she could think of, to be agreeable, to be accomplished, to be beautiful, to be modest, to be helpful, to be quiet, and none of it had mattered. None of it had been enough to make him see her as anything more than an obligation he had fulfilled by marrying her and could now safely ignore. The evenings brought dinner, often shared in silence when there were no guests. Catherine would sit at the opposite end of the long table from Lord Ashford, the distance between them marked by gleaming silver and crystal, by elaborate centerpieces of hothouse flowers that seemed to mock the barrenness of everything else. Lord Ashford would read his correspondence while eating, or he would discuss estate matters with his steward if the man was dining with them, and Catherine would sit quietly, eating without tasting, existing without living, counting the minutes until she could excuse herself and retreat to her rooms. On the rare occasions when Lord Ashford did address her directly, it was always regarding some practical matter. A dinner party that needed to be arranged, a guest who would be staying at the house, some household concern that required her attention. He never asked about her day, her thoughts, her feelings. He never seemed curious about the woman he had married, the person she was beyond her role as his Marchioness. Catherine thought often of other marriages she had observed, trying to understand where her own had gone so wrong. Lady Pemberton and her husband seemed genuinely fond of each other, their interactions marked by easy affection and shared jokes. The Hartleys bickered constantly, but with an underlying warmth that suggested real intimacy, a comfort with each other that came from truly knowing and being known. Even the Thorntons, whose marriage was rumoured to be more practical than passionate, appeared to enjoy each other's company, to take pleasure in shared activities and conversation. Catherine could not identify a single moment when Lord Ashford had seemed to take pleasure in her company, when he had looked at her with anything approaching warmth or interest or genuine regard. She was useful to him, she supposed. She managed his household competently. She appeared at his side at social functions. She fulfilled her duties as his Marchioness, but she was not valued, not cherished, not seen as a person with her own interior life, her own hopes and dreams and desires. Sometimes, late at night, Catherine would lie awake in her bed and wonder what it would be like to be loved. Not the passionate, overwhelming love she read about in novels, but simply to be cared for, to matter to someone, to have one's presence be a source of joy rather than indifference. She had never experienced romantic love. Her marriage had been arranged for practical reasons, to save her father's failing estate and to provide Lord Ashford with a suitable wife of appropriate lineage, but she had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that some form of affection might develop over time, that proximity might breed fondness, that shared life might create connection. Instead, the years had brought only increasing distance, an ever-widening gulf between them that seemed impossible to bridge. Lord Ashford lived his life, managing his estates, attending to his parliamentary duties, spending time with his friends and associates, and Catherine lived hers, the two of them occupying the same house but inhabiting entirely different worlds, rarely intersecting, never truly touching. The weight of this existence pressed down upon Catherine with increasing force as the years passed. She was 26 years old, and she felt ancient, exhausted, as though she had already lived several lifetimes of quiet despair. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who had begun to fade, her eyes dull, her skin pale, her entire being marked by the accumulated weight of being perpetually overlooked. She dressed each morning and arranged her hair and put on her pleasant, neutral expression, and she went through her days performing her duties with competence and grace, and no one noticed that she was disappearing, that she was becoming less real with each passing season, that the woman she had once been, or might have been, was slowly dying of neglect and indifference. She had no one to speak to about this, no confidant who might understand the particular agony of her situation. Her mother was dead, her father had remarried and moved to the continent, Her friends from girlhood had married and moved away, or had their own concerns and families to occupy them. The women she knew socially were not intimates. Their relationships were based on duty and proximity rather than genuine connection, and Catherine could not imagine revealing her true feelings to any of them, could not bear the thought of becoming an object of pity or gossip, and so she kept her grief private, locked away in the deepest chambers of her heart, and she continued to perform her role with the same quiet dignity she had always maintained, because dignity was all she had left, the only thing that belonged entirely to her. Outside, the world continued its relentless turning. Winter gave way to spring, the gardens burst into bloom, and life reasserted itself in all its abundant variety. But inside Ashford, house inside Catherine's carefully maintained existence, nothing changed, nothing grew, nothing bloomed. She remained exactly as she had been, silent, invisible, present, but unseen, and she began to wonder if this was simply her fate, if some women were born to be overlooked, to live their entire lives in the shadows of other people's regard, never experiencing the warmth of genuine attention or care. The only moments that troubled this suffocating stillness were the occasions when she caught Lord Ashford watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, something almost like confusion or perhaps curiosity, as though he had suddenly remembered she existed and was trying to understand why she was there. These moments never lasted long. He would blink, shake his head slightly as though clearing some unwelcome thought, and then look away, his attention returning to whatever task or person had previously occupied him. But Catherine felt these glances like small electric shocks, jolting her out of her careful numbness, reminding her that she was still capable of feeling something beyond resignation and quiet grief. She did not know what to make of these moments, did not dare to hope they signified anything meaningful. Hope had disappointed her too many times before, had left her more wounded than simple acceptance ever could, and so she filed these observations away, tucked them into the same place she kept all her other unspoken thoughts and feelings, and she continued forward through her days, waiting, though for what she could no longer say. The spring season brought a flurry of social obligations, and Ashford House filled with guests as Lord Ashford hosted a series of dinners and gatherings for his political associates and their families. Catherine performed her duties as hostess, with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, ensuring that menus were planned to perfection, that rooms were prepared for overnight guests, that every detail was attended to with care. She moved through the crowded rooms with practiced grace, speaking when spoken to, smiling appropriately, ensuring that everyone was comfortable and entertained, and all the while remaining somehow peripheral to the events she had organized, a ghost drifting through her own home. It was at one of these gatherings that something shifted, though Catherine did not recognize it at first for what it was. Lord Ashford had invited the Duke of Thornfield and his family to stay at Ashford House for a week, along with several other prominent families. The Duke was an influential man in Parliament, and Lord Ashford was eager to secure his support for some legislative matter Catherine did not fully understand and had not been invited to discuss. The Thornfield family arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a procession of elegant carriages, and Catherine greeted them in the entrance hall with her usual composure, welcoming the Duke and Duchess, their 2 daughters, and their son, Lord Edmund Thornfield, who was perhaps 30 years old and possessed of the easy confidence common to men of his class and privilege. Lord Edmund was handsome in a conventional way, fair-haired, blue-eyed, with a ready smile and an animated manner of speaking. At dinner that first evening, he was seated beside Catherine, and to her surprise, he actually engaged her in conversation, asking about her interests, her opinions on various books and topics, her thoughts on the estate and the key surrounding countryside. Catherine responded carefully at first, unaccustomed to genuine attention, but Lord Edmund seemed sincerely interested in what she had to say, and gradually she found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, discussing poetry and philosophy, sharing her observations about the natural world, even venturing a few gentle opinions on political matters that Lord Edmund seemed to find intelligent and insightful. Down the length of the table, Lord Ashford was engaged in deep conversation with the Duke of Thornfield, but Catherine noticed, though she tried not to, that her husband's gaze occasionally drifted in her direction, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed her conversation with Lord Edmund. She thought nothing of it at first. Lord Ashford had never shown any particular interest in whom she spoke with or what she discussed, and she assumed his attention was simply the natural vigilance of a host, ensuring his guests were well entertained. But as the evening progressed and Lord Edmund continued to monopolize Catherine's attention, telling her amusing stories and laughing at her own tentative attempts at wit, she became aware that Lord Ashford was watching them with increasing frequency, his expression difficult to read but somehow darker than usual, his jaw tight with some emotion she could not identify. The pattern continued over the following days. Lord Edmund seemed to find excuses to be near Catherine, to draw her into conversation, to solicit her opinions and views. He walked with her in the gardens, discussing the various plantings and sharing his own knowledge of horticulture. He sat beside her in the drawing-room in the evenings, turning the pages of music for her when she was persuaded to play the pianoforte, praising her skill with what seemed like genuine admiration. He was attentive in a way Catherine had never experienced, treating her as though her thoughts mattered. Her presence was valuable. Her company was something to be sought rather than endured. She knew she should not allow herself to enjoy this attention, knew it was dangerous to her carefully maintained equilibrium, but she could not help the small warmth that bloomed in her chest when Lord Edmund smiled at her, the unfamiliar sensation of feeling seen, heard, appreciated. She was careful, of course, to maintain absolute propriety. She never allowed herself to be alone with Lord Edmund, never permitted any gesture or word that might be construed as improper, but she could not control the way her face brightened when he entered a room, the way her voice gained color and energy when she spoke with him, the way she seemed to come alive in a manner that made the previous 7 years of her existence seem like a kind of living death. She did not realize that this transformation was visible to others, did not understand that the woman she became in conversation with Lord Edmund was so markedly different from her usual subdued self, that it could not help but draw notice. Lord Ashford noticed. Catherine became increasingly aware of his attention, the way his eyes followed her when she moved through a room, the way his conversation would halt mid-sentence when Lord Edmund said something that made her laugh. She caught him watching her with an expression that seemed almost troubled, his brow furrowed, his mouth drawn into a hard line. Once, when she excused herself from the drawing-room to check on some household matter, she found Lord Ashford standing in the corridor outside, as though he had been waiting for her. He looked at her strangely, opened his mouth as though to speak, then seemed to think better of it, and simply nodded curtly before walking away. Catherine stood in the empty corridor, her heart beating strangely fast, wondering what he had meant to say, why he had looked at her with such intensity, but she had no answers, only questions that multiplied like shadows. One evening, there was to be a ball at Ashford House, a grand affair with guests from all the neighbouring estates and beyond. Catherine spent days preparing, working with Mrs. Davies to ensure every detail was perfect, the ballroom decorated with thousands of candles and arrangements of white roses, the orchestra engaged from London, the supper planned to impress the most demanding palates. She herself prepared with unusual care, selecting a gown of deep blue silk that brought out the colour of her eyes, allowing Mary to arrange her hair in an elegant style that framed her face softly. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who was almost beautiful, almost alive, and she felt a strange flutter of something that might have been hope, or might have been simply the echo of who she could have been in a different life. The ball began as all such events did, with the formal receiving of guests, the opening dances, the elaborate performance of social ritual. Lord Ashford led Catherine in the first dance, as was proper, and they moved through the familiar steps in silence, not looking at each other, touching only when the dance required it. When the dance ended, Lord Ashford bowed formally and moved away to attend to his other guests, and Catherine felt the familiar weight of his indifference settle over her once more. But then Lord Edmund appeared at her elbow, requesting the next dance, and Catherine accepted, and as they moved together across the floor, she felt herself transform once again from the invisible woman she had been into someone real, someone present, someone who mattered. They danced 3 times that evening, more than was strictly proper, enough to cause murmurs among the observing matrons, and Catherine knew she should refuse his subsequent requests, should spread her attention among other partners, but she could not bring herself to deny him, could not bear to return to invisibility when she had tasted, however briefly, what it felt like to be seen. Lord Edmund spoke to her as they danced, his voice low and warm, telling her she looked lovely, that her company was the brightest part of his visit, that he had never met a woman with her particular combination of intelligence and grace. Catherine knew these were the sort of compliments men paid to women as a matter of course, knew she should not take them seriously, but they fell upon her starved heart like rain on parched earth, and she absorbed them desperately, hungrily, with a need that frightened her in its intensity. During the third dance, Catherine became aware of Lord Ashford standing at the edge of the ballroom watching them. His face was unreadable, but his posture was rigid, his hands clasped behind his back in a way that suggested barely controlled tension. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Catherine felt something pass between them, a challenge, perhaps, or an accusation, or simply the acknowledgement of a distance that had grown too vast to bridge. She looked away first, unable to sustain that intense gaze, and when she looked back, Lord Ashford had disappeared into the crowd. After the ball, when the last guests had departed and the house fell quiet, Catherine climbed the stairs to her chambers with exhaustion settling into her bones. It had been a successful evening by any measure. Everyone had praised the entertainment, the food, the beauty of the decorations, but Catherine felt hollowed out, emptied of whatever brief vitality she had experienced during those dances with Lord Edmund. She was removing her jewellery when there came a knock at her door, and before she could respond, the door opened, and Lord Ashford entered her chamber, something he had not done in years, something so unusual that Catherine froze, her hands still raised to unclasp her necklace. "Lord Ashford," she said quietly, her voice carefully neutral, "is something amiss?" He stood just inside the doorway, still dressed in his evening clothes, his cravat slightly loosened, his expression strange and troubled. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and Catherine felt her heart begin to race, uncertain what this unexpected visit might mean, what he might be about to say. "You danced with Lord Edmund 3 times this evening," he said finally, his voice low and tight. Catherine lowered her hands slowly, letting them fall to her sides. "I did," she acknowledged. "Is that a concern?" "It appeared improper," Lord Ashford said. "People will talk." Something cold and hard formed in Catherine's chest. 7 years. 7 years of being ignored, overlooked, treated as though she barely existed. And now he came to her chamber to criticize her conduct, to concern himself with appearances, with what people might say. She looked at him, this stranger she had married, this man who had never once danced with her beyond the minimum required by obligation, who had never paid her a compliment or shown any interest in her company, and she felt something inside her begin to crack. "Let them talk," she said softly, and even she was surprised by the edge in her voice, by the hint of steel beneath the customary quiet. Lord Ashford's eyes widened slightly. "Catherine, is there anything else, my lord?" she asked, turning away from him, her hands trembling as she resumed removing her jewellery. "I am quite tired." She heard him draw a breath, heard him take a step toward her, and then stop. The silence stretched between them, heavy with words unsaid, with years of accumulated distance and indifference. And then, without another word, Lord Ashford turned and left her chamber, closing the door behind him with careful control, and Catherine stood alone in the candlelight, her reflection in the mirror showing a woman she barely recognized, someone with color in her cheeks, fire in her eyes, something fierce and wounded, and finally beginning to wake. The Thornfield family departed 3 days later, their carriages pulling away from Ashford House in the early morning mist. Catherine stood at the drawing-room window and watched them go, Lord Edmund turning to look back at the house one final time before the carriage rounded the bend and disappeared from view. She felt his departure as a loss, which was foolish. She barely knew him. Their acquaintance had been brief and circumscribed by propriety, and yet his presence had reminded her that she was capable of being more than the silent, invisible woman she had become. In his company, she had remembered what it felt like to be treated as though her thoughts mattered, her opinions had value, her existence was worthy of attention. And now he was gone, and she was left once again with only the suffocating silence of her marriage, the endless grey landscape of her daily existence. Lord Ashford had been different since the night of the ball. He watched her with a new intensity, his gaze following her movements whenever they were in the same room. He spoke to her more frequently, asking questions about household matters that he had never bothered to inquire about before, appearing in the library when she was reading, in the morning room when she was writing correspondence. Catherine found this newfound attention more unsettling than his previous indifference. She did not understand what had prompted this change, could not determine whether it represented genuine interest or simply some form of possessiveness, a territorial instinct triggered by Lord Edmund's attentions. She responded to his questions with polite brevity, maintaining the careful distance she had cultivated over years of protecting herself from disappointment, refusing to allow hope to take root in the barren soil of her heart. One afternoon in May, Catherine was walking in the gardens when Lord Ashford appeared on the path before her. She had thought him away on business in London, had come outside precisely because she believed she would be alone, and his sudden presence startled her. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable, blocking her path forward. "Catherine," he said, and there was something in his voice she had never heard before, hesitation, perhaps, or uncertainty. "I would speak with you." She waited, saying nothing, her face carefully composed. "I have been thinking," he continued, and he seemed to struggle with the words, as though conversation with his own wife was unfamiliar territory, difficult to navigate. "I have been thinking about Lord Edmund's visit, about his attentions toward you." Catherine felt something cold slide through her chest. "Lord Edmund was perfectly proper," she said quietly. "If you are suggesting otherwise—" "No," Lord Ashford interrupted. "That is not what I mean." He paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal difficulty. "I mean only that I observed how you were with him, how you spoke, how you smiled. You seemed different, more alive." Catherine looked at him, this man who had had 7 years to notice, her to see her, to observe that she was slowly dying of neglect and indifference, and who apparently required another man's attention to recognize that she was capable of being more than the silent ghost he had reduced her to. The anger that had been building inside her since the night of the ball suddenly crystallized into something sharp and clear. "Is that surprising to you, my lord?" she asked, her voice still soft but carrying an edge she had never allowed him to hear before. "That I might seem more alive when speaking with someone who actually listens to what I say? Who treats me as though my thoughts and feelings have some value?" Lord Ashford's jaw tightened. "I have never suggested your thoughts lack value. You have never suggested they have any," Catherine replied. "In 7 years of marriage, you have never once asked me what I think about anything beyond household management. You have never inquired about my interests, my opinions, my feelings about any matter of consequence. You speak to me only when necessary, look at me only when propriety requires it, and then you wonder why I seem more alive in the company of someone who treats me as though I am actually present." She watched emotions flicker across his face, surprise, discomfort, something that might have been shame. But when he spoke, his words were defensive, his tone hardening. "I have provided you with everything a woman could want," he said. "A grand house, fine clothes, a position in society. That many would envy. You want for nothing." Catherine felt something break inside her, something that had been cracked for years, finally shattering completely. She looked at this man, this stranger, who genuinely believed that material comfort was sufficient substitute for human connection, for regard, for basic acknowledgement of her existence as a person rather than an ornament or a servant. "I want for everything," she said quietly, and her voice trembled despite her efforts to control it. "I want to be seen, to be heard, to matter to the man I married. But those are things you cannot purchase, my lord, and things you have never thought to offer." Lord Ashford stared at her, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes, pain perhaps, or recognition, or simply confusion. But before he could respond, the Dowager Marchioness appeared on the garden path, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with evident displeasure. "Catherine," the Dowager said coldly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I have been looking for you. We must discuss the arrangements for the summer house party. Come." It was not a request. The dowager had never treated Catherine with anything but thinly veiled contempt, making clear in countless small ways that she considered her son's wife to be barely adequate to her position, lacking in the proper breeding and accomplishment expected of a marchioness. Catherine had learned to endure these subtle cruelties with silent dignity, had learned that responding or defending herself only made things worse, only confirmed the dowager's low opinion of her, and so she simply inclined her head in acknowledgement, not looking at Lord Ashford, and followed the dowager back toward the house. The following weeks brought a new kind of torment. The dowager had taken up residence at Ashford House for the summer, ostensibly to assist with the planning of the house party, but actually, Catherine suspected, to monitor and criticize every aspect of Catherine's conduct. The older woman found fault with everything. The way Catherine managed the servants, the menus she selected, the flowers she chose for the arrangements, the gowns she wore. Nothing was adequate, nothing met the dowager's exacting standards, and every criticism was delivered in front of Lord Ashford. Every correction offered in a tone that suggested Catherine was hopelessly incompetent. Lord Ashford did nothing. He sat in silence while his mother belittled his wife, offered no defense, no support, no suggestion that Catherine's choices were acceptable or that the dowager's constant criticism was unjust. His silence felt like complicity, like confirmation that he agreed with his mother's assessment, that Catherine was indeed the inadequate, disappointing creature the dowager treated her as being. The wound this inflicted was deep and lasting, cutting through whatever remained of Catherine's carefully constructed defenses, leaving her raw and bleeding in ways no one could see. The house party arrived in June, bringing dozens of guests who would stay for 2 weeks. Catherine managed every detail with her usual competence, ensuring that rooms were prepared, meals were served flawlessly, entertainments were organized and executed perfectly. She smiled, made pleasant conversation, fulfilled every obligation of a hostess with grace and dignity. And through it all, the dowager watched her with cold, critical eyes, finding opportunities to undermine her in small ways, to make subtle comments that diminished Catherine in the eyes of the guests, to ensure that everyone understood that Catherine, while adequate to her duties, was nothing special, nothing remarkable, certainly nothing worthy of particular regard or respect. One evening during a grand dinner, the conversation turned to the subject of accomplished women. Lady Pemberton was praising her daughter's skill at the harp, and several other mothers joined in to boast of their own daughters' talents. The dowager, sitting at Catherine's right hand, listened with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and then she spoke, her voice carrying down the length of the table. "It is so important for young women to develop their talents," she said. "I always impressed upon my son the necessity of marrying a woman of real accomplishment. Sadly, one cannot always achieve one's ideal, but one does what one must for the sake of family and duty." The table fell silent. Every person present understood the implication, understood that the dowager was publicly declaring her son's marriage to Catherine to be a disappointment, a compromise, a settling for less than what had been hoped for. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face, felt every eye in the room turn toward her, felt the weight of pity and embarrassment and contempt settle over her like a shroud. She looked down the table at Lord Ashford, willing him to say something, anything to defend her, to correct his mother's cruel implication, to indicate that he did not share this view of their marriage. Lord Ashford said nothing. He looked uncomfortable, his jaw tight, but he remained silent, allowing his mother's words to stand unchallenged. And in that moment, Catherine understood with perfect clarity that she was entirely alone, that she had always been alone, that there would be no rescue, no defense, no acknowledgement that she deserved better than this. The man she had married, the man she had tried so hard to please, the man she had given 7 years of her life to, could not even summon the basic courage to defend her against his mother's public cruelty. She finished the dinner somehow, moving through the remainder of the evening in a haze of pain, so intense it felt almost like numbness. When the meal concluded and the guests moved to the drawing room for music and cards, Catherine excused herself, claiming a headache, and retreated to her chambers. She locked the door behind her and stood in the darkness, not bothering to light candles, not moving, simply existing in the black silence of her room. She thought of Lord Edmund, of the way he had looked at her as though she mattered. She thought of the woman she had been during those brief days, the way she had felt alive and present and real, and she thought of the woman she had become in the years of her marriage, diminished, erased, reduced to something less than human, an object to be used and criticized and ultimately dismissed as inadequate. She thought of all the years stretching ahead of her, decades more of this existence, of being perpetually unseen and undervalued, and she felt something inside her finally, irreparably break. She did not cry. She had cried too many times before, alone in this room, and tears had brought no relief, no change, no comfort. Instead, she made a decision, one that came from some deep place she had not known existed, some core of strength she had never accessed before. She would not continue like this. She would not spend the rest of her life trying to earn recognition from people who had decided she was unworthy of it. She would not beg for scraps of attention from a man who could not see her even when she was standing directly before him. She would not allow herself to be erased any further. She did not know yet what form this decision would take, what actions might follow from this moment of clarity. She knew only that something fundamental had shifted inside her, that the woman who left this room in the morning would not be the same woman who had entered it tonight, that she had reached the end of her capacity to endure, and something new, something harder, fiercer, more dangerous, was taking its place. Outside her window, the summer night was alive with sound. Crickets singing, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. Catherine stood in the darkness and listened to the world continuing its indifferent turning, and she felt her own internal revolution. Beginning, quiet and deep, and absolutely irrevocable. Catherine descended to breakfast the following morning with her shoulders straight and her expression serene. The dowager was already seated at the table, discussing the day's plans with Lord Ashford, and neither of them looked up when Catherine entered. She took her usual seat and accepted tea from the footman with a quiet word of thanks. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting geometric patterns across the white tablecloth, and Catherine looked at these patterns rather than at the two people who shared the room with her, and yet seemed to exist in an entirely different world. The dowager was speaking about calling on neighbors that afternoon, suggesting that Catherine should accompany her to pay respects to several families in the area. Catherine listened in silence, sipping her tea, and when the dowager finally paused and looked at her expectantly, waiting for agreement or acknowledgement, Catherine set down her cup with careful deliberation. "I'm afraid I will be occupied this afternoon," she said quietly. "I have other plans." The dowager's eyebrows rose. "Other plans? What plans could possibly take precedence over social obligations?" Catherine looked at her mother-in-law with calm, steady eyes. "Personal ones," she said simply. The silence that followed was charged with tension. The dowager was not accustomed to being contradicted or refused, particularly not by Catherine, who had spent 7 years acquiescing to every demand, every criticism, every dismissal of her preferences and feelings. Lord Ashford looked up from his correspondence, his gaze moving between his wife and his mother with apparent confusion. "Catherine," the dowager said, her voice dropping into a dangerous register, "I do not think you understand the importance of these calls. Your presence is required." "No," Catherine said softly, "it is not." She rose from the table, her movements graceful and unhurried, and left the room before either of them could respond. Behind her, she heard the dowager's sharp intake of breath, heard the rustle of movement that suggested Lord Ashford had risen as well, but she did not pause, did not look back. She walked through the corridors of Ashford House with purpose, climbed the stairs to the gallery where generations of Ashford family portraits looked down with solemn expressions, and she stood before these painted faces and felt absolutely nothing. No intimidation, no sense of inadequacy, no concern for whether she measured up to their standards or expectations. The house party guests were gathering for a planned excursion to a nearby village known for its market and ancient church. Catherine had organized every detail of the outing, had arranged for carriages and prepared baskets of refreshments, but she did not join them. Instead, she spent the afternoon in the library, reading, thinking, allowing herself the radical luxury of simply being still without purpose or obligation. When Mrs. Davies came to inquire about dinner preparations, Catherine gave her instructions with calm authority and then returned to her book. When a footman brought a message from the dowager demanding Catherine's immediate presence, She sent back a reply indicating she was indisposed and would speak with the dowager at a more convenient time. She was establishing boundaries, reclaiming space, asserting that her time and her life belonged to her, and not to people who had never valued them anyway. It was a small rebellion, barely visible to external observation, but it represented a fundamental shift in Catherine's understanding of herself and her position. She was a marchioness, yes, but she was also a person, an individual with her own thoughts and needs and right to exist on her own terms. She had forgotten this, or perhaps she had never fully believed it, but she believed it now with absolute conviction. Lord Ashford appeared in the library as the afternoon. Light began to fade toward evening. He stood in the doorway looking at her with an expression that seemed almost helpless, as though he had entered unfamiliar territory and did not know how to navigate it. "Catherine," he said, "my mother is quite upset." Catherine looked up from her book, meeting his gaze directly. "Is she?" she said. It was not a question. "She says you have been disrespectful, that you refuse to accompany her on calls, that you have been avoiding your obligations." "I have been attending to my own needs," Catherine said calmly. "Something I should have done long ago." Lord Ashford moved further into the room, and Catherine noticed that he seemed uncertain, his usual confidence visibly shaken. "I do not understand what has happened," he said. "You have been different since Lord Edmund's visit, more difficult." Catherine felt something cold and sharp move through her chest. "Difficult," she repeated softly. "Yes, I imagine that's how it appears when a woman finally stops accepting treatment that diminishes her, when she stops pretending that being ignored and undervalued is acceptable simply because it is convenient for everyone else." "I have never meant to diminish you," Lord Ashford said, and there was something almost pleading in his voice. Catherine set down her book and rose to her feet. She moved to the window and looked out over the gardens, her back to her husband. "Intent is less relevant than effect, my lord. You have had 7 years to notice that I exist as more than a piece of furniture, more than a servant to manage your household. 7 years to ask me what I think, what I feel, what I want from life. 7 years to defend me against your mother's constant belittling, and you have done none of these things." She heard him move closer, felt his presence behind her, but she did not turn around. "I thought you were content," he said quietly. "You never complained. You never indicated—" "I was silent," Catherine interrupted. "There is a difference between contentment and silence. I was silent because I learned that speaking changed nothing, that my feelings were of no interest to you, that it was easier to simply endure than to repeatedly expose myself to your indifference." The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Catherine could hear Lord Ashford's breathing, could sense his struggle to understand, to process this version of his wife that he had apparently never imagined existed. Finally, he spoke again, his voice strained. "What do you want, Catherine? Tell me what you want and I want to be seen," Catherine said. And now she did turn to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "I want to be valued as a person, not just as the woman who manages your house and appears at your side when propriety requires it. I want what you gave to Lord Thornfield and the Duke and every man in your club: conversation, respect, genuine interest in my thoughts and perspectives. I want what you have never even thought to offer me, because you have never considered me worthy of such regard." Lord Ashford looked stricken, his face pale in the fading light. "Catherine, But Catherine held up her hand, stopping him. "Do not make promises now, my lord. Do not offer assurances that you cannot keep. I have spent too many years hoping, waiting, believing that things might change if only I was patient enough, good enough, quiet enough. I will not do that anymore. I will not wait for scraps of attention from a man who should have valued me from the beginning." She moved past him, heading toward the door, and this time, when he reached out as though to stop her, she simply kept walking, and he let his hand fall without touching her, and Catherine left the library with her head high and her heart beating hard against her ribs. The evening brought another dinner with the house-party guests, and Catherine attended with her usual composure, but something in her had fundamentally altered, and everyone could sense it even if they could not name it precisely. She spoke when spoken to, smiled appropriately, fulfilled her duties as hostess, but there was a new quality to her presence, a stillness that was not submission, a quietness that was not meekness, an authority that she had never displayed before. She no longer seemed to shrink from attention or fade into the background. She occupied her space fully, with dignity and grace, and people found themselves actually seeing her, actually noticing her, actually registering her presence in ways they never had before. The Dowager attempted several times throughout the evening to make cutting remarks, to undermine Catherine with subtle criticisms, but Catherine simply looked at her with calm, steady eyes and said nothing, and somehow her silence was more devastating than any response could have been. The Dowager's criticisms fell flat, seeming petty and mean-spirited without Catherine's usual flinch or withdrawal to give them power. By the end of the evening, it was the Dowager who seemed uncomfortable, the Dowager who appeared diminished, while Catherine remained serene and untouchable. Lord Ashford watched all of this with an expression that grew increasingly troubled as the evening progressed. Catherine could feel his gaze on her constantly, could sense his confusion and perhaps his growing alarm as he witnessed her transformation, this quiet revolution she was enacting. When the guests finally retired and only the family remained, the Dowager turned to her son with fury in her eyes. "You must speak to her," the Dowager said sharply. "She has become impossible, insolent. She needs to be reminded of her place." Catherine stood near the fireplace, her hands folded calmly at her waist, and she met Lord Ashford's eyes across the room. She said nothing, simply waited to see what he would do, how he would respond, whether he would finally stand with her, instead of against her, or worse, simply absent himself from the conflict altogether. Lord Ashford looked between his mother and his wife, and Catherine saw the struggle on his face, saw him wrestling with years of habit, with his mother's expectations, with his own confusion about what was happening and what was required of him. The moment stretched out, silent and tense, and Catherine felt her heart beat slow and heavy in her chest, felt the weight of everything, all the years, all the hurt, all the hope and disappointment and resignation, pressing down upon this single instant. And then Lord Ashford spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Catherine is the Marchioness of Ashford. She requires no reminder of her place, and she does not answer to anyone regarding how she chooses to conduct herself within her own home." The Dowager's face flushed with anger. "How dare you—" "I dare because she is my wife," Lord Ashford said, and now his voice carried real steel, real authority. "And I have allowed you to treat her with disrespect for far too long. That ends now. You will speak to her with courtesy and regard, or you will not speak to her at all." Catherine felt something shift inside her chest, something that might have been hope, but felt more like shock, like disbelief that this was actually happening, that he was actually defending her, actually choosing her over his mother's demands and expectations. The Dowager stared at her son as though he had transformed into a stranger, her mouth opening and closing without sound, and then she turned on her heel and swept from the room in a rustle of silk and fury. Lord Ashford and Catherine stood alone in the drawing-room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the candles casting wavering shadows on the walls. He looked at her across the space between them, and his expression was raw, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "Catherine," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. But Catherine shook her head. Slowly. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for that. But one moment of courage does not erase 7 years of indifference, my lord. I appreciate what you just did, truly, but it does not change the fundamental reality of our marriage." "Then tell me," he said, and he moved toward her, his movements urgent. "Tell me what I must do to change it. Tell me how to make this right." Catherine looked at him. This man she had married so long ago, this stranger who had shared her life without ever truly seeing her, and she felt the weight of everything they had lost, everything they had never had, everything that might have been possible if only he had chosen differently, if only he had valued her from the beginning. "I don't know if it can be made right," she said honestly. "I don't know if what has been broken can be repaired, but I know that I will not continue as we have been. I will not be invisible in my own life anymore, and I will not settle for less than I deserve, simply because it is easier or more convenient for everyone else." She moved toward the door, and this time he did not try to stop her, simply watched her go with an expression of such profound loss that it almost made her pause, almost made her turn back. But she continued forward, leaving him alone in the candle-lit drawing-room, and as she climbed the stairs to her chambers, she felt something inside her settle into place, a new understanding of herself, a new claim to her own worth, a new determination to live on her own terms, regardless of whether anyone else agreed or approved. She had spent 7 years trying to earn love, trying to deserve attention, trying to be enough. She understood now that she had always been enough, that the failure was not hers but his, that she could not make someone see her who had chosen to look away. And while this realization brought grief, it also brought a strange kind of freedom, a release from the endless effort of trying to matter to someone who had never thought to value her. Catherine entered her chambers and stood before the mirror, looking at her reflection in the candlelight. The woman who looked back at her was no longer fading, no longer disappearing. She was solid, present, real. She was seen by herself, if by no one else. And for now, perhaps that was enough. The Dowager Marchioness departed Ashford House the following morning. There was no formal farewell, no dramatic confrontation, simply the sight of her carriage pulling away in the early light. While Catherine watched from the window of the breakfast room, a cup of tea growing cold between her hands, Lord Ashford had arranged his mother's departure with quiet efficiency, had spoken with her privately in his study for over an hour before she left, and whatever had been said between them resulted in the Dowager's immediate removal to the Dower House, with instructions that she was to await a formal invitation before returning to Ashford House in future. It was an unprecedented action, a clear statement of changed priorities, and Catherine felt both gratitude and a strange emptiness as she witnessed it. He was trying, she could see that, but trying was not the same as healing, and the wounds of 7 years ran deep, cutting through places that could not easily be mended. The house party continued for another week, and during that time Catherine maintained her new composure, her new claim to her own space and worth. She no longer deferred to every demand, no longer apologized for existing, no longer tried to make herself smaller or quieter or less present. She engaged in conversations with genuine interest, expressed her opinions when asked, and carried herself with a quiet dignity that drew people to her rather than causing them to overlook her. Several of the female guests actually sought out her company, seeming to genuinely enjoy her conversation, and Catherine discovered with surprise that she was capable of forming real connections when she stopped trying so, desperately to be liked, and simply allowed herself to be herself. Lord Ashford watched all of this with intense attention. He appeared wherever she was, in the drawing-room, the gardens, the library, not intruding but present, observing, as though trying to understand who she actually was beyond the silent shadow he had married. Several times he attempted to initiate conversation beyond the merely practical, asking her opinions on books, on current events, on matters he had never previously thought to discuss with her. Catherine responded with careful courtesy, engaging honestly but maintaining a certain distance, a protective barrier she was not yet ready to lower. She could see that her responses frustrated him, that he wanted more access, more warmth, more indication that his efforts were succeeding, but she owed him nothing beyond basic civility, and she would not pretend to feelings she did not have, simply to ease his discomfort. One afternoon, toward the end of the house party, Catherine was walking alone in the rose garden when she came upon Lord Ashford standing near the fountain, apparently lost in thought. He looked up at her approach, and something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, hope, fear. She nearly turned away, nearly chose a different path, but something made her continue forward, made her stop near enough to speak, but far enough to maintain distance. "The roses are beautiful this year," she said quietly, looking at the blooms that surrounded them, white and pink and deep crimson, their petals soft and luminous in the afternoon light. "You chose the varieties," Lord Ashford said, "years ago. I remember you consulting with the head gardener, making plans for the rose garden. I thought it a harmless enough occupation." Catherine looked at him, heard the careful neutrality in his tone, the suggestion that he had permitted her this small thing as one might permit a child to play with toys. She felt anger rise in her chest, but pushed it down, choosing instead to speak her truth calmly. "I would have done more with the gardens," she said. "I would have redesigned many things. would have created spaces of real beauty and interest. But your mother made clear that the gardens were her domain, that my involvement was unwelcome, that my ideas were presumptuous. And you said nothing. You allowed her to dismiss me, to claim authority that should have been mine as the marchioness of this estate. Lord Ashford's jaw tightened. I did not. Realize you did not notice, Catherine corrected gently. You did not care enough to notice, and that, my lord, has been the pattern of our entire marriage. Not malice, not cruelty, simply indifference. A failure to see me, to value me, to recognize that I had anything to offer beyond basic competence in household management. I see you now, he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. God help me, Catherine. I see you now. Catherine looked at him, this man who had finally opened his eyes only after she had stopped begging him to, only after she had made it clear that his attention was no longer necessary to her survival or sense of self. She felt a complicated tangle of emotions, grief for what had been lost, anger at how long it had taken, exhaustion at the thought of having to rebuild anything from these damaged foundations. Yes, she said quietly, you see me now, when it is almost too late, when I have already decided that I will survive without your regard, that I will find worth and meaning in my life, whether or not you choose to acknowledge it. You see me now that I have stopped desperately needing to be seen. Is it too late? He asked, and there was something naked in his voice, vulnerable in a way that might once have moved her deeply, but now simply made her tired. I don't know, Catherine said honestly. I don't know if what we had, or rather, what we never had, can be built now, after so many years of nothing. I don't know if I have the strength or the desire to try. I don't know if you are capable of sustaining this attention, or whether it will fade once the novelty wears off, once I am no longer performing this new version of myself that seems to interest you. I want to try, Lord Ashford said. I want to know you, really know you. I want— He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. I want what I saw when you spoke with Lord Edmund. The way you came alive, the way you smiled. I want to be the one who inspires that in you. Catherine felt something twist in her chest, something that might have been compassion or might have been simply weariness. Then you should have wanted that 7 years ago, she said softly. You should have wanted it when I was young and hopeful and desperate for your attention. You should have wanted it before I learned to survive without it. She moved past him, continuing her walk through the garden, and this time he did not follow. She heard him draw a breath as though to call after her, but then, stop! And she continued forward alone, surrounded by the roses she had planted years ago, breathing in their sweet scent, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun on her face. She was alive. She was present. She was enough, all by herself, and whether Lord Ashford came to understand that or not was ultimately his concern rather than hers. The house party concluded, and the guests departed in a flurry of carriages and farewells. Catherine stood in the entrance hall and received their thanks with gracious smiles, and several of the women embraced her warmly, expressing genuine pleasure in having come to know her better, in having discovered that the quiet marchioness was actually a woman of depth and intelligence and unexpected strength. After the last carriage pulled away, Ashford House fell into silence, vast and echoing, and Catherine walked through the empty rooms, feeling as though she was seeing them clearly for the first time. This was her home, whether she felt at home in it or not. These were her responsibilities, whether anyone acknowledged her authority or not. This was her life, and she would claim it fully, shape it according to her own values and desires, regardless of whether Lord Ashford chose to be a true partner in that endeavour, or remained the distant, indifferent stranger he had been for so long. In the weeks that followed, a strange new pattern emerged. Lord Ashford continued his attempts to bridge the chasm between them, to demonstrate his newfound attention and regard. He began taking his breakfast in the morning room with Catherine rather than in his study. He asked her to walk with him in the evenings, to discuss the day's events, to share her thoughts on the books she was reading. He consulted her on matters of estate management that he had previously handled alone, genuinely seeking her input, rather than simply informing her of decisions already made. He even, to her surprise, asked her opinions on political matters, on the legislation being debated in Parliament, and he listened to her responses with apparent interest, sometimes arguing with her positions, but in a way that suggested genuine intellectual engagement rather than dismissal. Catherine participated in these interactions with cautious wariness, neither fully trusting his transformation nor able to completely resist the pull of finally being treated as though she mattered. She was honest in her responses, expressed her real thoughts and feelings rather than the pleasant neutrality she had previously offered, and she found that they were capable, after all, of having real conversations, of discovering that they had some interests in common, that they could discuss matters of substance without it feeling like an obligation or a burden. But she maintained her emotional distance, refused to let down her guard completely, refused to allow hope to take root too deeply. She had been disappointed too many times before, had learned too well that attention could be withdrawn as easily as it was given, and she would not make herself vulnerable again unless she had real reason to believe the change was permanent. One evening in late summer, as they walked together through the gardens in the golden light before sunset, Lord Ashford stopped beside the fountain and turned to face her. Catherine paused as well, waiting, watching him with calm, guarded eyes. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you said, about not knowing if I can sustain this attention, about whether this is merely novelty that will fade." Catherine said nothing, simply waited for him to continue. "I cannot prove to you that it will not," he said. "I cannot offer you guarantees or assurances that will erase the past 7 years, but I can tell you this. I have been a fool, a blind, arrogant fool who took you for granted because you were always there, always quiet, always uncomplaining. I convinced myself that your silence meant contentment, that your lack of protest meant satisfaction. I never stopped to wonder what you might be feeling, what you might be sacrificing, what it might cost you to live with my indifference." He paused, and Catherine saw genuine anguish in his expression, real recognition of the harm he had caused through his neglect. "Seeing you with Lord Edmund," he continued, "seeing you come alive in conversation with him, it was like watching a stranger, and I realized that the stranger was my own wife, that I had lived beside you for 7 years, and knew nothing about who you actually were beyond the role you performed. And then I felt jealous, bitterly, irrationally jealous, not because I feared you would be unfaithful, but because he had access to something I had never even known existed. He saw you, he valued you, and I had had that opportunity all along and had simply not taken it." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes, but blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. "And so you want it now," she said, quietly. "Because another man demonstrated its worth, because my value became apparent only when someone else recognized it." "Yes," Lord Ashford said, and his honesty surprised her. "That is exactly what happened. And I know how that reflects on me. I know it suggests that my interest is selfish, possessive, that I want you only because I suddenly felt I might lose you, and perhaps there is truth in that. But Catherine, I also know that seeing you as you truly are, strong, intelligent, dignified more than I ever imagined, has changed something fundamental in how I understand our marriage, how I understand what I have been denying both of us by refusing to engage with you as a full person rather than merely a convenience." Catherine looked at him, this man who was finally speaking to her with real honesty, real vulnerability, real recognition of his own failures. She felt the weight of decision pressing down upon her, felt the pull of 2 possible futures, one in which she remained closed, protected but alone, and one in which she risked opening herself again to potential disappointment, but also to the possibility of something real. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to see that this is not temporary, not simply a reaction to feeling threatened or challenged. I need to see that you can sustain this level of engagement, this recognition of my worth, not just for weeks or months, but for years. I need to know that if I allow myself to believe in you, to trust you to open my heart again, you will not simply return to indifference once things feel comfortable and settled." "I understand," Lord Ashford said, "and I will wait. I will prove it to you, Catherine, however long it takes." Catherine nodded slowly, and they continued their walk in silence, the evening light fading around them, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She did not know what the future would bring, did not know if they would find their way to real partnership, real love, or whether this tentative beginning would ultimately lead nowhere. But she knew that she had changed, had claimed her own worth, had refused to settle for less than she deserved, and that regardless of what happened with Lord Ashford, she would never again allow herself to disappear, to become invisible, to live as though her existence did not matter. The months that followed brought gradual shifts, small changes that accumulated into something more significant. Lord Ashford continued. His attentive behaviour, and slowly, tentatively, Catherine began to believe that perhaps it was real, perhaps it would last. They developed routines together, morning walks, evening conversations, shared reading time in the library. He consulted her on every major decision, genuinely valued her input, defended her choices to anyone who questioned them. When the Dowager attempted to reassert her influence, Lord Ashford firmly maintained the boundaries he had established, making clear that Catherine's authority as Marchioness would be respected and supported. He even, to Catherine's profound surprise, commissioned a complete redesign of the gardens according to her vision, hiring the finest landscape architects and giving her free rein to create whatever she desired. And slowly, very slowly, Catherine felt the ice around her heart begin to thaw. She began to smile more genuinely, to laugh more freely, to engage with him not out of duty, but out of genuine interest and pleasure. She began to share more of her true self, her thoughts, her dreams, her fears, the wounds of the past 7 years that still ached on cold days. And Lord Ashford listened, really listened, with attention and care and evident remorse for his role in causing that pain. He could not undo the past, could not erase the years of neglect and indifference, but he could acknowledge them, apologize for them, commit to doing better going forward. By the time winter returned to Ashford House, bringing snow that blanketed the grounds in white silence, Catherine and Lord Ashford had become something they had never been before. Partners. Not lovers, not yet. That territory was still too fraught, still required more healing, but partners in the truest sense. Two people working together to build something real, something worthy, something neither of them had imagined possible in those first terrible years of their marriage. They spoke as equals, argued as intellectual companions, laughed as friends. And Catherine discovered that the man she had married, the man she had thought she knew, was actually capable of depth and growth and change, was capable of recognizing his own failures and working to address them. One evening, as they sat together in the library before the fire, Lord Ashford reading correspondence while Catherine worked on embroidery, he looked up suddenly and simply watched her, his expression thoughtful. Catherine felt his gaze and glanced up, meeting his eyes with a question in her own. "I was just thinking," he said quietly, "that I almost lost you, that if you had not found the strength to stop accepting my indifference, to demand better, I would have continued in my comfortable blindness and never known what I was missing. You saved our marriage, Catherine, not by being patient or quiet or endlessly accommodating, but by refusing to disappear any longer." Catherine set down her embroidery and looked at him fully, this man who had hurt her so deeply and who was now working so hard to heal those wounds. "I saved myself," she said gently. "The marriage is something we are building together now, but first I had to save myself. I had to decide that I mattered, that my life had value, that I deserved to be seen and heard and regarded. Everything else has followed from that decision." "Then I am grateful," Lord Ashford said, "that you are stronger than I am, that you had the courage to break the pattern we had fallen into, even when it would have been easier to simply continue as we were." "It was never easy," Catherine said. "Continuing as we were was killing me slowly, invisibly, but just as surely as any illness. I simply reached the point where I could no longer survive that way." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Then Lord Ashford rose and crossed to where Catherine sat, kneeling beside her chair in a gesture of surprising humility. "I know I cannot undo the past," he said quietly. "I know I caused you years of pain through my neglect and indifference, but I want you to know that I see you now, Catherine. I see your strength, your intelligence, your grace. I see everything I missed before, everything I was too foolish and blind to value, and I will spend the rest of my life ensuring that you never again feel invisible or unvalued or alone." Catherine looked down at him, this proud man kneeling before her, offering her finally what she had needed all along: recognition, regard, genuine commitment to seeing and valuing her as a whole person. She felt something warm bloom in her chest, something that might have been hope, or might have been the beginning of real love, earned and chosen rather than expected and denied. "Then rise," she said softly, reaching out to touch his face gently, "and let us move forward together, not as lord and silent wife, but as two people who have finally learned to truly see each other." He rose, taking her hand in his, and they stood, together in the firelight, two people who had traveled through years of darkness and indifference to finally arrive at this moment of genuine connection, genuine possibility. Catherine knew that challenges would remain, that healing would take time, that some scars would never fully fade. But she also knew that she had reclaimed herself, had demanded her own worth, had refused to accept less than she deserved. And in doing so, she had not only saved herself, but had created the possibility for something real, something honest, something built on mutual regard and respect. Outside, the winter night was dark and cold, but inside Ashford House, in the library where Catherine had spent so many solitary hours, there was warmth, there was light, there was the promise of something better. She had been silent for 7 years, had allowed herself to fade and disappear, but her silence had finally broken something in both of them, had shattered the comfortable indifference they had maintained, had forced recognition and change, had created space for truth and growth and transformation. She had triumphed, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through the quiet, persistent act of claiming her own worth, of refusing to be erased, of insisting that she mattered. It was a victory that belonged entirely to her, earned through pain and struggle and fierce, dignified determination. And while Lord Ashford was learning to see her now, learning to value her as she deserved, Catherine understood that the most important witness to her transformation had been herself. She had seen herself, she had valued herself, she had chosen herself, and that in the end was the truest triumph of all. The silence that once defined Lady Catherine Ashford's existence became the force that finally demanded recognition. Not through accusation or anger, but through the dignified act of refusing to disappear, she transformed not only her own life, but illuminated the profound cost of indifference. Her journey reminds us that sometimes the most powerful revolution occurs not in grand declarations, but in the quiet claiming of our own worth, in the refusal to accept invisibility as our fate. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and continue discovering the voices that were silent for far too long.